What's up, guys? NFL Week 2 is upon us. I got 5 players set for huge weeks in fantasy this week. Let's get right to the list, and we start with a running back, Isiah Pacheco of the Kansas City Chiefs, going up against the Bengals. Chiefs-Bengals, it's always going to be a headliner, but it's even more fascinating for me this week, given what we saw from Cincinnati in Week 1. We know Burrow and the Bengals, they always play well against the Chiefs. Burrow's 3-1 straight up in his career against Kansas City, but we also know the Bengals always seem to struggle in Week 1. They're starting 0-1 for the third straight year. Now, history suggests since you'll get its act together, they'll find a way to hang around in this game, but I have some real concerns about what we saw from the Bengals defense in Week 1 against New England. They knew exactly what the Patriots were going to do. Play conservatively with Jacoby Brissett. He was 2 of 6, by the way, on passes further than 10 yards down the field, and run the ball. That's the plan. Control the clock. If you're New England, you kind of know what your limitations are, and the Bengals should have known that as well. Even with an obvious game plan and an offensive line that, by all accounts, and even from Gerard Mayo himself, was horrific in training camp in the preseason, Ramondre Stevenson got loose for 120 yards on the ground against the Bengals. A huge chunk of that yardage came after contact. Stevenson was getting 3 yards per carry after contact in Week 1. Now, we should probably talk about Pacheco himself. He is the subject here. Relatively quiet in Week 1 against Baltimore, 15 for 45, did run in a short touchdown, but keep in mind the Chiefs only ran 54 plays in that game compared to 70 for Baltimore. Pacheco was in on 43 of those 54 snaps. We'd love to see that. I think this is a much higher volume day for Isiah Pacheco in Week 2, a game that the Chiefs are comfortable winning on the ground if they can. But bottom line, last week, Cincinnati did not have to worry about the Pats passing game whatsoever and still gave up a huge game to Ramondre Stevenson. Now you have to worry about what might be, the best passing attack in the NFL, at least one of the top 3, in addition to trying to fix that run defense over the course of a week. I don't like that dilemma for Cincinnati. Give me Pacheco to have a big Week 2. Another running back I like this week, Brian Robinson of the Washington Commanders. They get a matchup against the Giants. Kind of a disjointed Week 1 for Washington. Saw some good things, but tough to get a full evaluation when you're down multiple scores for the majority of the game. Either way, Robinson was one of the few positives for Washington from a fantasy perspective. While he played only 2 more snaps than Austin Eckler, Robinson outcarried Eckler 13-2, and both backs saw the same number of targets despite Eckler running 8 more routes. Essentially, Robinson touched the ball on half of the snaps, and that was in kind of this off-script game where the Commanders had to either pass or, Jaden Daniels just took off for much of the second half. By the way, love what we saw from Daniels as a rusher in Week 1, but Dan Quinn, maybe not so much. He did say this week that he doesn't want Daniels carrying the ball as much as he did in Week 1, so that's something to keep an eye on. Either way, I think we see a much closer game this week against the Giants. I think it's a better script for Brian Robinson. Should equate to a higher rushing workload. New York, they may have some names on that defensive line, but they were among the worst rush defenses in the entire league in Week 1. Gave up 6.7 yards per carry to Aaron Jones. Jones had 5 runs in that game of at least 10 yards. 74 of his 94 yards came after contact, according to PFF. Last season, Giants were 30th in the NFL in yards per carry allowed, but they were solid in terms of limiting running backs as receivers out of the backfield. So I think this week is much more of a Brian Robinson spot than an Austin Eckler spot for the Commanders. I'm comfortable starting Robinson in most of my leagues, and I think he could be poised for a big day. Before we get to our next player, if you're enjoying this video, please take a moment, give it a like, make sure you're subscribed to the RotoWire YouTube channel so you never miss any of our content through the rest of the NFL season. All right, number 3, we're staying with this Giants-Commanders game. I know there won't be a lot of eyeballs on it, but I think there actually could be some fantasy value to be had here. Malik Nabers playing in a second NFL game. I'll put this very simply. It could already be time to panic for the Giants, but if Daniel Jones can't get it going against the Commanders defense, it's officially full-on panic time after Week 2. Commanders hemorrhaged yards, hemorrhaged fantasy points to the Buccaneers receivers last week. Baker Mayfield had one of the best games of his entire career. I'm not saying Daniel Jones is capable of replicating that, but if there is a matchup for him to start turning the narrative in his favor, this has to be it, which brings us to Nabers, who quietly had a solid NFL debut, 5 catches on 7 targets for 66 yards. Most importantly, he played all 70 offensive snaps. A third of his yardage in Week 1 came after the catch. Washington, meanwhile, had the worst coverage grade of any team in Week 1, according to PFF. They don't really have a great matchup for Malik Nabers. They don't really have this number 1 corner who can travel. I think this could be the spot for Malik Nabers to put up his first 100-yard game in the NFL. And realistically, with the Browns, Cowboys, Seahawks, and Bengals looming on the schedule in the next 4 weeks, this might be his best opportunity for a monster game early in the season. One tight end who I really like to have a big week 2, Trey McBride of the Arizona Cardinals, gets a really interesting in-division matchup against the LA Rams. Now, McBride was part of the overall tight end carnage in week 1 when we saw future Hall of Famers Isaiah Likely, Foster Moreau, Brock Bowers, Kyle Pitts, Jawan Johnson. Yes, that's 2 Saints tight ends not named Taysom Hill, who finished in the top 5 in fantasy production at the position last week. But McBride, yeah, he only gave you 8 fantasy points. The underlying numbers show very few concerns here. McBride played 85% of the Cardinals' offensive snaps. He led the Cardinals with 9 targets, 29% target share on 31 pass attempts for Kyler Murray. I would expect the Cardinals to make more of a point to get Marvin Harrison involved this week, but I'm a little concerned with how he looked in week 1. Some of the underlying numbers on him were a bit concerning, so we'll see. I think McBride is still Kyler Murray's go-to guy in this offense. This should be a plus matchup against a Rams defense that doesn't have a lot of talent in the back end, a lot of inexperience at linebacker. Keep in mind, the Rams were dead last in the NFL last season in yards per target allowed to tight ends, 8.3 yards per target. That was about a full yard above league average. Trey McBride in a position to smash in week 2. Our 5th and final player on the list, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We got a high total in Detroit, 2 big-time offenses going at it. Lions gave up the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers last season. They've taken some steps to try to address that, but still too early to tell. They knew what was coming last week against the Rams and still could not slow down Cooper Kupp. We saw Tyler Johnson making big plays for the Rams as well. And that was essentially a one-man show, right? I mean, it was Stafford and Cooper Kupp that kept the Rams in that game. Now you have to worry about Mike Evans. You have to worry about Godwin, maybe even Jalen McMillan, who looked pretty good in his debut in week 1. Rashad White, Bucky Irving in the backfield. The Lions are going to be able to move the ball on the banged-up Bucs secondary, but if I'm Tampa Bay, I know I need to throw the ball to keep up in this game. I love this spot for Chris Godwin, who got off to a very nice start in week 1 against the Commanders. 8 targets, 8 catches, 83 yards in a game that turned into a run-the-clock-out script for Tampa Bay in the 4th quarter.